British Empire did not collapse when the Second World War ended. The war only revealed what had already begun. For more than a century, Britain had ruled an empire that stretched across the globe. Its ships controlled the oceans. Its banks financed international trade. Its currency connected markets from London to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Britain looked almost impossible to defeat. But behind the flag, behind the battleships, and behind the wealth of the empire, Britain was running out of money. In 1925, Britain made a decision that was supposed to restore its financial greatness. Instead, it helped expose just how much Britain's economic power had already weakened. Then came the Great Depression, then another world war, and when Britain finally emerged victorious in 1945, it had won the war, but lost much of the financial power that had sustained its empire. Britain was becoming a debtor. America was becoming the world's financial superpower, and the old imperial system was standing between them. Then came Lend-Lease, Bretton Woods, the struggle over Britain's trade preferences, and finally, Suez. In 1956, Britain discovered something that would change the world forever. It could no longer act as an independent superpower without American support. So how did the most powerful empire on earth go from the world's greatest creditor to a nation dependent on American financial power? The answer is not simply war. It is not simply nationalism. It is money. And once you follow the money, the collapse of the British Empire begins to look very different. At the beginning of the 20th century, Britain stood at the center of an extraordinary global system. The British Empire stretched across enormous territories. India was one of its most important possessions. British influence extended through Africa, the Middle East, Asia, the Caribbean, and beyond. The Royal Navy protected trade routes across the world's oceans. And London had become one of the most important financial centers on Earth. British banks, merchants, insurers, and investors financed projects across continents. Railways were built, mines were developed, ports expanded, goods moved through imperial trade networks, and British capital flowed far beyond Britain's own borders. The pound sterling became a crucial currency for international commerce. But maintaining this enormous system required more than flags and soldiers. It required money. Before the First World War, Britain was one of the world's great creditor nations. British investors held enormous amounts of overseas assets. Foreign governments borrowed British money. Businesses depended on British finance, and London sat at the heart of the global financial system. Then, in 1914, the First World War changed everything. Britain entered a conflict that consumed enormous amounts of resources. Factories had to be redirected toward war production. Millions of men were mobilized. Ships and weapons had to be produced on an industrial scale. And the government needed extraordinary amounts of money to keep the war going. Britain began selling overseas assets. It borrowed heavily. And increasingly, it relied on financial support from the United States. The war ended in 1918. Britain was on the winning side. Its empire still existed. Its navy still sailed the oceans. Its flag still flew across enormous territories. But beneath that appearance of strength, Britain was no longer in the same financial position it had occupied before the war. The country had accumulated enormous debts. Its industrial competitiveness had weakened, and international trade had been disrupted. Yet British leaders wanted to restore the old financial order. They wanted the pound to regain its pre-war position. They wanted confidence to return to London. And in 1925, Britain made a historic decision. It returned to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. The move was intended to signal stability and restore Britain's financial prestige, but there was a serious problem. The British economy had changed. The world had changed. and the old exchange rate no longer matched Britain's weakened economic position. British exports became less competitive. Industry struggled. Unemployment remained painfully high in important regions. The country was trying to maintain the appearance of its old financial strength while the economic foundations underneath it were becoming weaker. And this was only the beginning, because a few years later, the Great Depression would strike the global economy. And when it did, the financial weaknesses Britain had been trying to hide would become impossible to ignore. The Great Depression transformed Britain's financial problem into something much more dangerous. The global economy contracted. International trade collapsed. Demand for British exports weakened. Factories reduced production, and unemployment spread across industrial regions. Britain was still an empire of enormous size, but its economic machine was struggling to generate the wealth needed to sustain that empire. The pressure eventually became too great. In 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard. The decision was a dramatic admission that maintaining the old financial system had become impossible. The pound could now fall to a level more compatible with Britain's economic reality. But the damage from the previous decade could not simply be erased. Britain had entered the 20th century as a major creditor nation. Now its financial position was becoming increasingly fragile. And then, in 1939, Europe entered another catastrophic war. The Second World War demanded resources on a scale Britain could barely afford. Britain mobilized its military. Factories were transformed for war production. Ships crossed dangerous waters carrying essential supplies. Aircraft filled the skies. And the British government spent enormous sums simply to keep fighting. The empire provided soldiers, raw materials, food, and strategic resources. But the war was draining Britain's financial reserves. The United States became increasingly important. American industry was producing enormous quantities of weapons and supplies, and Britain needed access to them. Then came Lend-Lease. The arrangement allowed Britain to receive vast quantities of American equipment and supplies while postponing the immediate financial burden. For Britain, this was essential. It helped keep the country in the war, but it also revealed a fundamental change in the balance of economic power. Britain could still command armies. It could still control territory. It could still fight. But increasingly, it depended upon the industrial and financial strength of another country. The United States was becoming the world's great economic powerhouse. American factories were producing at extraordinary scale. American financial reserves were enormous, and the American dollar was becoming increasingly important to the future international economy. By the time the war ended in 1945, Britain had survived. But victory had come at a tremendous financial cost. British cities had been bombed, infrastructure had been damaged, foreign assets had been sold, debts had accumulated, and the country faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding while still trying to maintain a worldwide empire. The British flag still flew across vast territories, but the economic foundations beneath that flag had changed dramatically. The war had not destroyed the British Empire. Something more subtle had happened. It had weakened the financial power required to maintain it. And now, as the world prepared for peace, the United States was helping design a completely new international financial system. Britain would soon discover that the post-war world was not going to be built around the old British order. It was going to be built around a new center of economic power. And that center was across the Atlantic. The Second World War had ended. Germany was defeated. Japan had surrendered. Britain was still standing, but the financial world Britain had dominated for generations was disappearing. The war had left Britain with enormous debts, weakened industries, damaged infrastructure, and a desperate need for foreign currency. Across the Atlantic, the United States emerged from the war in a completely different position. American factories had expanded dramatically. The United States held enormous financial reserves, and much of the world's monetary gold was now concentrated in American hands. The center of global economic power was moving west. In 1944, representatives from dozens of countries gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the financial system that would govern the post-war world. The British delegation arrived with ambitious plans, but the American vision increasingly dominated the negotiations. A new international monetary system was created. The US dollar became the central currency of the system, while the dollar itself was tied to gold. The International Monetary Fund was established. The World Bank was created, and the financial architecture of the post-war world increasingly revolved around American economic power. For Britain, this created a difficult reality. The empire still existed. British officials still wanted to preserve imperial trade, and Britain still depended heavily on its overseas territories. But the United States had its own vision for the future. Washington generally opposed the old system of exclusive imperial trading blocs. America wanted a more open international economy where goods and capital could move more freely. Britain's system of imperial preference stood in the way of that vision, and Britain was too financially weak to simply ignore American pressure. Then came another blow. Britain needed American financial assistance to rebuild its economy. The post-war years became a struggle between imperial ambitions and financial reality. Britain wanted to remain a global power, but maintaining an empire required enormous resources. Military bases had to be maintained. Colonial administrations had to be funded. Trade routes had to be protected. And political instability was spreading across the empire. In India, independence had already arrived in 1947. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, nationalist movements were gaining strength. Britain was discovering that controlling territory was becoming increasingly expensive, and every crisis required money. Money that Britain increasingly did not have. The old imperial system had depended on British financial strength, but that strength was disappearing. The pound was under pressure, foreign currency reserves were limited, and the United States now possessed enormous leverage over the international financial system. Britain had survived 2 world wars, but survival was not the same as power. The empire still looked enormous on a map. Yet behind that map, the financial foundations were weakening year by year. And then, in the 1950s, Britain attempted to prove that it was still an independent world power. The opportunity came in Egypt. The crisis that followed would become the moment when Britain's financial weakness could no longer be hidden. It would be called the Suez Crisis, and it would reveal just how much the balance of global power had changed. By the 1950s, the British Empire still looked powerful on the map, but the reality was changing rapidly. Britain was trying to maintain military bases, protect trade routes, support overseas territories, and defend its remaining influence across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Every one of those responsibilities required money, and Britain's financial position was becoming increasingly fragile. Then, in 1956, the crisis came. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal. For Britain, this was not simply a dispute over a waterway. The canal was one of the most important strategic routes, connecting Europe with the Middle East and Asia. It was also deeply connected to Britain's remaining global influence. British leaders feared that losing control of Suez would mean losing much more than access to a canal. It could signal that Britain's days as a major imperial power were coming to an end. Britain decided to act. Together with France and Israel, it secretly planned military action against Egypt. Israeli forces moved into Sinai. British and French forces prepared to intervene. Aircraft filled the skies. Warships moved through the Mediterranean. And for a moment, it appeared that Britain was prepared to use military force to protect its strategic interests. But there was one problem. The United States did not support the operation. President Dwight Eisenhower's administration opposed the invasion. Washington feared that the crisis would destabilize the Middle East and damage relations with Arab countries during the Cold War. But America's opposition was not merely diplomatic. Britain was facing a financial emergency. The pound came under intense pressure. Foreign currency reserves were being drained, and Britain desperately needed American cooperation. Washington had leverage, and Britain could not easily ignore it. The United States could refuse financial assistance. It could oppose emergency support through international financial institutions, and it could put additional pressure on Britain's already vulnerable currency. The message was becoming impossible to misunderstand. Britain might still possess an empire. It might still possess a powerful military, but it no longer possessed the financial independence required to act like the world's dominant superpower. Under intense American pressure, Britain agreed to withdraw. The invasion collapsed. The Suez Crisis lasted only weeks, but its psychological impact was enormous. Around the world, the message was clear. Britain could no longer make major imperial decisions without considering the financial and political power of the United States. Suez did not single-handedly destroy the British Empire. The empire had already been weakening for decades. Nationalist movements were growing. Colonies were demanding independence. Britain's economy was struggling, and the cost of maintaining global power was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. But Suez exposed the new hierarchy of the world. Britain was no longer the unquestioned leader of the Western imperial system. America was. And after Suez, Britain's retreat from empire accelerated. Across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, the old imperial structure continued to disappear. One territory after another moved toward independence. The British flag was lowered. New national flags were raised, and an empire that had once seemed permanent began to dissolve. But behind the political collapse was a deeper story.